On the afternoon of September 27, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neri Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a remote and dusty desert in South Australia. This vast, barren area was called Maralinga. Neri and his brothers belonged to an isolated Aboriginal tribe known as the Martu people. On this particular day, the boys were out doing what their people had done for generations. They were hunting for food to bring back to their family. Specifically, they were tracking kangaroos. Neri, being the oldest, carried a hunting spear, while his two younger brothers carried a wooden club and a traditional boomerang. For hours, they had been quietly following a specific group of kangaroos across the dry terrain. But every single time the boys got close, just as they would slow down and prepare to strike, the kangaroos would suddenly sense them and bolt away. It was incredibly frustrating, and the afternoon sun was starting to beat down on them. But they kept going because their family was relying on them for dinner. Eventually, as they continued their long trek, the kangaroos stopped. They had gathered around a small watering hole just a few dozen yards away from where the brothers were hiding. Neri looked at his brothers and knew this was their absolute best chance. The kangaroos were thirsty, and they were going to stay at that watering hole long enough for the boys to make their move. Neri quietly signaled to his younger brothers that it was time to advance. They dropped low into the dry brush, moving as silently as possible, inching closer and closer to their targets. But after taking only a few cautious steps, a strange and terrifying sound shattered the quiet of the desert. It started as a low, deep, rumbling noise vibrating through the ground from somewhere off in the distance. The brothers stopped in their tracks. Before they could even understand what was happening, the entire sky suddenly lit up. It was an impossibly bright, blinding white light, so intense that Neri had to quickly shield his eyes with his arms just to keep from being blinded. And as he was doing this, a massive, incredibly hot gust of wind came roaring through the desert. This was not a normal desert breeze. It was a violent shockwave that blasted right into them, literally lifting the brothers off their feet and slamming them hard onto the dirt. They lay there, completely disoriented, with their ears ringing and their skin burning from the sudden heat. From the ground, Neri struggled to turn his head to see what had happened to his brothers and the environment around them. He looked over in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos had been just moments before. And what he saw next made absolutely no sense to him. The kangaroos were literally floating high up in the air, drifting right toward them through the hazy sky, and then they suddenly dropped heavily onto the ground. A moment later, it was as if a switch had been flipped. Everything just went back to normal. The blinding white light faded, and the sky returned to its usual blue color. The deep rumbling stopped, and the hot wind died down completely. The desert was quiet once again. Except now, right in front of Neri and his brothers, lay a dozen dead kangaroos. The boys stood up, dusted the dirt off their clothes, and tried to process what they had just witnessed. They had absolutely no concept of modern technology or what could cause such a massive explosion. To them, living their isolated life, there was only one logical explanation. They looked at this incredible bounty of fresh meat lying right at their feet, and they decided this must have been a gift from God. They believed that God had literally reached down, taken the lives of these kangaroos, lifted them up, and delivered them directly to the brothers so their tribe wouldn't go hungry. Filled with gratitude, Neri and his brothers began lifting the heavy animals, carrying as many of the dead kangaroos as they possibly could manage back to their camp. When they arrived and told their people what had happened, the tribe was overjoyed. That very night, they held a massive celebration to honor this miraculous gift from God. They built a large fire, roasted the kangaroo meat, and held a giant feast. Almost everyone in the tribe ate the meat, celebrating their good fortune. But the very next morning, the celebration turned into a nightmare. When the tribe woke up, nearly everyone who had eaten the kangaroo meat was violently ill. People were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies were covered in painful red rashes, and they were suffering from intense aches and deep internal pain. Over the next few days, some of the tribe members slowly began to recover, but many others only got worse. Soon, people from the tribe began to die. one after the other. Neri and the surviving members of the tribe immediately made the connection. They realized that whatever was killing their people was directly tied to the kangaroo meat they had eaten. Some members of the tribe who had been skeptical about the gift from God theory argued that the meat must have been poisoned. But they had no idea how it had been poisoned, or if someone had done it on purpose. For Neri and his people, this tragic event remained an unsolved mystery for over a decade. Fast forward to 11 years later, in 1967, when Neri was 24 years old. That was when representatives from the British government finally arrived in the remote areas of southern Australia near where the Martu tribe lived. It turned out these officials were there to try and clean up a massive, dangerous mess they had created years earlier. And that was when the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Those dead kangaroos that had seemingly floated through the air and dropped at the feet of Neri and his brothers were not a gift from God at all. Instead, they were the victims of a highly classified, top-secret scientific experiment. The British government had been using the Maralinga Desert to test active nuclear weapons. On that afternoon in 1956, Neri and his brothers had been standing just a few kilometers away from an active nuclear detonation site. Where they were positioned was the absolute perfect spot to experience the fringe effects of a nuclear blast. They saw the blinding flash of the detonation, they heard the deafening roar of the shockwave, and they felt the intense thermal radiation that knocked them to the ground. But because they were just far enough away, the blast wave did not kill them. It only disoriented and bruised them. However, the kangaroos at the watering hole were positioned slightly closer to the epicenter of the bomb. Because the kangaroos were closer, and because they were much smaller animals, they were completely vulnerable to the full force of the pressure wave. The shock wave had killed the kangaroos instantly, lifted them into the air, and thrown their bodies forward, landing them right in front of the boys. But the worst part was that the blast had coated the animal carcasses in highly concentrated, invisible radioactive fallout. When the tribe cooked and ate the meat, they were ingesting lethal amounts of radiation. This caused severe acute radiation sickness, which explained the sudden vomiting, the skin rashes, and the agonizing deaths. The British government kept these tests secret for years, and an unknown number of indigenous people lost their lives due to the radioactive contamination. Eventually, after the truth came out, the Australian government ended up paying $13.5 million in compensation to the Aboriginal tribes that were devastated by the nuclear tests. Neri Morgan survived the ordeal, and today he is in his 80s, still sharing this incredible and tragic story with younger generations so that the history of his people is never forgotten. Now, let's move to another afternoon, this one in the fall of 2019, in a quiet neighborhood in Knoxville, Iowa. It was around 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, October 26th, and 56-year-old Pamela Kramer was enjoying a beautiful day in her son's backyard. Pamela was a warm, family-oriented woman who worked during the week as an assistant at a nearby United States Army base. But her job was just a way to pay the bills. Her true passion in life was her family. She lived for her husband, for children, and her grandchildren. On this particular Saturday, the family had gathered in the backyard for a very special occasion. They were holding a gender reveal party for Pamela's son and his pregnant wife, who were expecting a new baby. Pamela was absolutely thrilled and could not wait to find out if she was going to have a new grandson or granddaughter. After everyone had chatted and enjoyed some food, Pamela's son announced to the guests that it was finally time for the big reveal. The guests, including Pamela and several other close relatives, got excited and backed up toward the safety of the wooden fence on the side of the yard to get a good view. Pamela pulled out her mobile phone and began recording a video. She wanted to capture every single second of this beautiful moment so she could look back on it for years to come. In the center of the yard, the family had set up a homemade device that was supposed to shoot a cloud of colored powder into the air. Blue powder would mean it was a boy, and pink would mean it was a girl. Pamela's son walked out to the middle of the lawn and leaned over the device. He turned back to the crowd, smiled, and asked if everyone was ready. Pamela gave him a big thumbs up, keeping her phone pointed directly at him. Her son then bent down and lit a fuse attached to the device. He quickly backed away, running over to stand next to his pregnant wife along the fence line with the rest of the family. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the colorful cloud to appear. But instead of a beautiful puff of colored powder, a deafening metallic explosion shattered the air. In an instant, the peaceful backyard turned into a war zone. The homemade device was not just a harmless powder launcher. The family had built the device using a thick metal cylinder which they had packed tightly with gunpowder and the colored dust, sealing the top and bottom. When the son lit the fuse, he had unknowingly created a highly volatile pipe bomb. The immense pressure of the burning gunpowder could not escape the metal pipe safely, causing the steel cylinder to rupture and violently explode. Sharp, jagged metal shrapnel was blasted in every direction at incredible speeds, flying up to 400 feet away. Some pieces of metal tore through the wooden fences of neighboring homes, while others lodged themselves into the walls of the house. Tragically, one large piece of the exploding metal flew directly toward the fence line where the family was standing. It struck Pamela directly in the head, knocking her to the ground. The backyard erupted into total chaos as family members screamed in terror and rushed to call emergency services. When the first responders arrived, they found a devastating scene. Metal debris was scattered everywhere, and Pamela was lying near the fence, having died instantly from her injuries. It was a heartbreaking tragedy that shocked the local community. Miraculously, despite the heavy shrapnel flying all over the yard and through the neighborhood, no one else was injured. Because the incident was determined to be a tragic and unintentional accident, the local authorities decided not to file any criminal charges against the family. Now, let's fast forward to another clear morning on October 30th, 2014, in Wichita, Kansas. A 54-year-old Russian pilot named Sergei Galitsky walked into the Flight Safety International building located at the Wichita National Airport. Sergei was accompanied by his personal translator. Sergei was a highly experienced pilot who had spent over 30 years flying commercial jets and helicopters back in Russia. But on this day, he was in Kansas to obtain a specific certification to fly a Cessna turboprop plane. Because he did not speak fluent English, he brought his translator along to help him communicate with the flight instructors and understand the technical training. Inside the lobby, the translator explained to the front desk clerk that Sergei was there for his scheduled training session. The clerk smiled, nodded, and went to the back of the building to locate Sergei's designated instructor. A few moments later, the clerk returned with 78-year-old Jay Ferguson. Jay was a legendary flight instructor with decades of aviation experience, known for his thoroughness and deep knowledge of aircraft. After shaking hands and greeting each other, Jay led Sergei and the translator through the security doors and deep into the state-of-the-art training facility. As they walked down the hallways, they passed several large, high-tech rooms filled with millions of dollars worth of advanced aviation equipment. Eventually, Jay stopped the group in front of a massive, white spherical pod that sat mounted on top of a complex hydraulic base. To an ordinary person, it looked like a high-tech simulator ride you might find at an amusement park. But to Sergei, he knew what this was. This was a professional-level flight simulator designed to perfectly mimic the flight dynamics, cockpit layout, and emergency scenarios of a real Cessna aircraft. Even though Sergei had thousands of hours of real flight experience, the aviation authority required him to complete several simulated flights in this exact pod to prove his competency before they would allow him to pilot a real Cessna. Jay opened the heavy door to the simulator pod and gestured for the men to climb inside. Sergei climbed in first and sat down in the captain's seat on the left. Jay took the co-pilot's seat on his right, and the translator sat directly behind them so he could whisper instructions into Sergei's ear. Looking out the windows of the pod, Sergei was amazed by how realistic the simulation was. High-definition screens projected a perfect, three-dimensional view of the actual runway at the Wichita National Airport. It felt exactly as if they were sitting on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. Together, Jay and Sergei began going through the rigorous pre-flight safety checklists, verifying the virtual instruments, testing the flight controls, and ensuring the radio communications were working perfectly. Once everything was verified, Jay pressed a control panel button to start the simulation. Instantly, the hydraulic base beneath the pod activated, and the entire cabin began to rumble and vibrate, perfectly mimicking the sound and feel of a powerful propeller engine roaring to life. Jay gave Sergey the signal to begin. Sergey released the parking brake, grabbed the control yoke, and pushed the throttles forward. The simulator tilted slightly backward, giving the men the physical sensation of accelerating down the runway. As they gained speed, Sergey pulled back on the yoke, and the digital scenery tilted down as they climbed high into the simulated sky. For the next several minutes, Sergey practiced maneuvering the aircraft through the virtual airspace, performing turns, climbs, and descents. The flight simulator's advanced hydraulics moved the pod in perfect synchronization with Sergey's inputs, making the flight feel incredibly lifelike. Jay watched closely, occasionally speaking into his headset, with the translator quickly relaying the instructions to Sergey in Russian. Sergey adjusted quickly to the Cessna's sensitive controls, and Jay was highly impressed by the Russian pilot's smooth handling of the aircraft. It was clear that Sergey was going to easily pass his certification test. After completing all the required maneuvers, Jay decided it was time to bring the session to a close and have Sergey perform a landing back at the airport. Sergey turned the simulated plane around, lined it up with the virtual runway, and began his final descent. He carefully managed his speed and altitude, bringing the plane down smoothly toward the asphalt. Everything was going perfectly. Sergey brought the nose up slightly, preparing for a soft landing. But the exact microsecond the virtual tires of the simulator touched down on the digital runway, a massive, deafening crash shattered the silence of the room, and everything instantly went black. At that very same moment, people standing outside on the tarmac and near the airport buildings heard a terrifying, thunderous explosion. They spun around and saw a thick, black column of smoke and giant flames shooting out from the roof of the Flight Safety International building. Bystanders immediately called 911 as sirens began to wail across the airport. When the firefighters and emergency crews arrived on the scene, they were shocked by the scale of the destruction. Part of the building's roof and walls had been completely pulverized, and a raging fire was consuming the interior. It would turn out that while Sergey, Jay, and the translator were inside the dark simulator pod, another pilot named Mark Goldstein was taking off from the very same airport in a real twin-engine passenger plane. Shortly after takeoff, Mark's real plane suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, causing him to lose complete control of the aircraft. The plane veered wildly off course, plunged toward the ground, and crashed directly through the roof of the Flight Safety International building. By an almost impossible and tragic coincidence, the crashing plane struck the exact room and the exact simulator pod where Sergey and his team were conducting their training. The violent impact and the subsequent fuel explosion instantly killed the pilot of the real plane, Mark, as well as Jay, Sergey, and his translator inside the simulator. It was a bizarre and tragic event that sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful, they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine, but the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned two things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Augat grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there, and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 inches the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. But she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on?" How are you really doing? Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So, the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K9 units and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the far northwestern corner of Canada lies one of the largest and most isolated regions on Earth, the Northwest Territories. To understand just how vast and empty this place really is, consider this. The entire country of Germany has a population of roughly 83 million people. The Northwest Territories is nearly 4 times larger than Germany, yet only around 50,000 people live there. It is a land that remains almost completely wild, defined by dense forests, towering mountains, violent rivers, and enormous lakes. Roaming through that wilderness are some of the largest predators in North America. Even for the most experienced outdoorsmen and women, the Northwest Territories can be an incredibly dangerous and unforgiving place to survive. And hidden deep within this already hazardous landscape lies a place many people refuse to enter at all. It's an 11,000 square mile stretch of pure, untamed wilderness known as the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the area became part of the Nahanni National Park Reserve. But don't let the word park fool you. This is not the kind of place families casually visit for a weekend camping trip. There are no hotels, no lodges, no visitor centers, and perhaps most importantly, there are no roads leading into or out of the valley. The only ways to reach it are by plane, by boat, or by attempting an extremely long and brutally difficult trek through the wilderness. But for those who are brave enough and willing to make the monumental effort to get inside this valley, they're rewarded with the chance to explore one of the most stunningly beautiful places on the entire planet. Because this section of the world has remained almost completely untouched by human hands, it represents nature in its most raw and purest form. However, there's a catch. The Nahanni Valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the few native tribes that have tried to settle inside the valley have all met with strange and unsettling fate. Some, like the Naha tribe, simply vanished without a trace. It was as if they disappeared overnight. They left behind all of their shelters, their food stores, and their supplies. They were just gone, and to this day, no one has any idea what happened to them. Other tribes have abruptly fled the valley, claiming they were being terrorized and stalked by mysterious creatures that lurked in the deep woods. They spoke of strange white demons and enormous wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, these stories sound like folklore, and it's entirely possible that's all they are. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things began to happen in the Nahanni Valley that were definitely not folklore. These events were real, they were documented, and they were horrifying. And, depending on how you look at it, they might just lend some credibility to the ancient beliefs of the native tribes, the belief that there is something truly evil lurking out in those forests, something that we just don't understand. It all started back in 1904. 3 brothers named Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they were going to head into the Nahanni Valley to search for gold. Their logic was simple. Since so few people had ever set foot inside the valley, they figured that if there was any gold to be found, it almost certainly hadn't been discovered yet. And so, after a very long and exhausting journey that involved sled dogs, trains, and even homemade boats, they finally managed to slip into the valley. They found themselves on a waterway known as the Flat River, which cuts right through the heart of the Nahanni Valley. The name Flat River is a bit ironic because it's anything but flat. In certain sections, it's more like a raging rapid. But either way, the 3 brothers were on their boat, making their way up the river. At some point, they pulled their boat onto the riverbank and set up a camp. Once their camp was established, they went down to the water's edge and placed their gold sluices in the river. A gold sluice is a long, narrow box, usually made of wood, with a strainer on one end. Gold miners submerge it in the water and then shovel sediment from the riverbed into a funnel at one end. The water and fine dirt flow out, but the strainer is designed to catch any heavier materials like gold nuggets. And so, the 3 brothers got their sluices set up and started the hard work of looking for gold. Almost immediately, they hit pay dirt. The river was filled with gold. They worked all day and into the night, pulling nugget after nugget from the water. The next morning, they did the same thing. By the time all of their containers were literally filled to the brim with gold, they decided it was time to head back, cash in their find, and then plan a return trip. So they packed up their tent, gathered all their supplies, and carefully loaded everything, including their newfound fortune, back into their boat. They pushed off from the shore and got back out onto the flat river. But very early into their journey back, disaster struck. The boat capsized in the powerful rapids. The force of the water was so strong that it actually broke the boat apart. The vessel sank, and most of their supplies, including every last bit of their gold, went down with it. The three brothers managed to survive. They grabbed what supplies they could, like their rifle, some lumber from the wreckage, and their mining gear, and swam everything to the shore. They collapsed on the riverbank, catching their breath, completely devastated by the loss of their gold, but thankful to be alive. They still had enough supplies to survive. They figured the only thing they could do was try to go back to their original campsite and see if they could find some more gold. They still had one of their sluices. So, using some of the lumber they had salvaged from their broken boat, and by cutting down a few trees, they managed to fashion a new, makeshift boat. They hopped back on the flat river and paddled their way back up to the spot where they had found so much gold just days before. They set up their camp again and put their sluice back in the water. But this time, they didn't find a single piece of gold. They spent the entire day searching, but it was a deeply disappointing effort. They had already lost a fortune, and now it seemed their luck had completely run out. That night, as they sat around their campfire, they decided that the next day they would just pack up and leave. So, the next morning, they got up, packed their gear, and got back on the new boat they had built. This time, they were able to successfully navigate the river, make their way out of the valley, and return to their homes. As soon as they got back, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, immediately started talking about going back to the Nahanni Valley. They knew there was more gold out there. There was no question about it. Sure, they didn't find it on that second attempt, but they had seen it with their own eyes. Charlie, the oldest brother, also wanted the gold, but he was more cautious. He felt like their first trip had been a very close call. The boat flipping over could have easily cost them their lives. He just didn't know if it was a good idea to risk it again. He told his brothers that he wasn't going to go. They could go if they wanted, but he was going to stay behind. Several months went by, and Willie and Frank spent that time meticulously preparing for their next expedition into the valley. Finally, in 1905, they were ready. Willie and Frank, along with a third man named Robert Weir, a friend of theirs who was taking Charlie's place, set off. The three men made their way back up into the valley. They didn't tell anyone exactly how long they planned to be gone, so when weeks passed with no word from them, Charlie wasn't particularly concerned. He knew how much gold there was to be had in the Nahanni Valley. He just figured they must have struck it rich again and had decided to stay out there for the long term, maybe through the summer or even into the next year. He wasn't worried, and because he wasn't worried, nobody else was either. And so, the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a year. Still, no one had heard a single word from the three men. Not from Willie, not from Frank, and not from Robert. But still, Charlie insisted that nothing could be wrong. He reasoned that there were three of them out there, they were all incredibly experienced outdoorsmen, and there was a ton of gold to be found. He was sure they were just having incredible success, acquiring a huge amount of gold, and that everyone would see them in the next couple of months, and everything would be just fine. But then, a whole other year went by. They had now been out there for 2 full years, and no one had heard from them. At this point, even Charlie had to admit that something might be wrong. He thought to himself, okay, it's time. I have to go out there and see if they're okay. And so, he rounded up 4 other people from his town and mounted a search expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to find his 2 brothers and Robert Weir. After yet another long and difficult journey, Charlie and his search party finally made it into the Nahanni Valley and onto the Flat River. They began making their way upstream, a treacherous journey through the river's rapids. The whole time, they were constantly scanning the riverbanks on both sides, hoping to see some sign of life. They were looking for any indication at all that the three men were out there and safe. But they saw nothing. They traveled all the way up to the very end of the Flat River, or rather the beginning of it, where it splits off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. Once they turned onto the South Nahanni, they began to travel downstream. Again, they scanned the banks on either side, searching for any sign of the three missing men. But there was nothing. Then, the river they were on took a very sharp turn. It's a place that's actually known as the Big Bend, a sharp 45-degree turn that dumps you directly into a 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, the South Nahanni River is about 350 miles long, and along its course, the water passes through 4 distinct canyons. They are labeled, in order, Fourth Canyon, Third Canyon, Second Canyon, and First Canyon. And these canyons are absolutely massive. The sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot straight up, sometimes as high as 3,000 feet above the water. And in some parts, the water itself is just as deep, plunging thousands of feet down. Second Canyon is unique because its cliff faces are about as sheer as you can get, and they butt up almost directly against the water, leaving very little shoreline on either side. Once you enter this 10-mile stretch, you are essentially boxed in. You have thousands of feet of deep, dark water below you, these massive, imposing cliffs on either side, and really nowhere to go. You have to navigate the entire length of this section of river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from your boat. And all along these cliffs, high up on both sides, you can see dark openings. These are the entrances to massive cave systems that wind their way through the insides of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. Because of how incredibly difficult it is to not only get to the Nahanni Valley, but also to access these high-up cave entrances, no one has really gone inside most of them. We simply don't know what's inside those caves, save for the few that are low enough for people to explore. So as you pass through Second Canyon, it almost feels like you're being watched. There are all these dark openings looking down on you, but you can't see into them. You're just forced to continue down this 10-mile stretch of water with nowhere to go and no way to escape the feeling that something is watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker. That's another feature of being in the canyon. The huge cliff walls block out most of the sunlight. So they would have paddled into this canyon, the light would have dimmed, and the wind would have picked up. It's very windy inside Second Canyon. It was a dark, strange, and unsettling setting for them to be in. They would have been looking at these small, narrow strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be beached, searching for any sign of life. But they didn't see anything. As they continued to make their way down this 10-mile stretch, getting closer and closer to the entrance of First Canyon, the next canyon in the series, the riverbanks started to widen slightly. There were some trees, and you could actually beach a boat there. And it was there, on the left-hand side, just before the exit of Second Canyon, that they noticed something. There was a tent, perched among some trees. The search party naturally steered their boat directly over to that shoreline. They hopped out, but as soon as their feet touched the land and they got a clearer view of the tent and the area around it, they saw it. There was a body clearly lying on the ground just outside of the tent. Charlie and the rest of the search party ran over. As soon as they got up close, they could tell that the body was missing its head. They also saw that the clothes on the body were totally charred and burned. The body was positioned in a way that suggested the person was reaching with their right arm when they died. And just outside the reach of that right arm was a rifle propped up against a tree. They walked around the first body and went towards the back of the tent where the opening was, and there they found another body. This one was also badly decomposed, and it was positioned halfway in the tent and halfway out. There was a blanket partially covering the body. When they moved the blanket, they saw that this body too was missing its head. So, Charlie and the search party continued to search the area around the camp, hoping they might find the heads of the two bodies so they could try to identify who they were. But they never found the heads. However, they did find some personal effects, both in the pockets of the two bodies and inside the tent, that confirmed their worst fears. These were Charlie's brothers. As for the third man who had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite. In fact, he would never officially be found. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be discovered several months later, and it was attributed to Robert, though that was never 100% confirmed. The only other interesting thing that was found at the campsite was a carving in a nearby tree. It just said, "We have found a fine prospect," which indicated that Charlie's brothers had in fact found gold. But there was no gold to be found. Not on their bodies, not in their camp, and not in the river nearby. There was nothing. Charlie and the search party left the valley and got in touch with the mounted police. The police came out to the site where the brothers had been found and launched an investigation. Ultimately, they came to the conclusion that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had simply starved to death. And then, after they had perished, animals had come and taken parts of them away, which would explain why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie didn't believe that for a second. He was convinced they had been attacked by native tribes in the area. But the police weren't buying that theory. They insisted it was a natural occurrence, a tragic accident, and that was that. When the story of the two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy. The public was very divided about what they thought had really happened. There was a percentage of people who believed that the partial skeleton found downstream was not Robert Weir. They believed that he hadn't died at all. Instead, he had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with all their gold. The other group of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by something. A person, a group of people, an animal, or maybe even some unknown creature. They believed there had been some sort of violent attack, and that's why the two brothers were found in those specific positions that suggested they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother desperately reaching for his gun, and the other appearing to have leaped from his bed before he died. But regardless of which side of the debate you fell on, pretty much everyone at the time who heard the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch of river in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so, that section of the river was renamed. From that point forward, it was known only as the Headless Valley. And even though it was clear that there were gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni and Flat Rivers, after this story broke, people were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so, for a while, people stayed away from the Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided he wasn't going to let some scary stories about headless men and ghosts and killers on the loose get in the way of him taking gold out of the Nahanni Valley. So, all by himself, Martin made the arduous trek into the valley. He made his way up the Flat River and finally found a spot about 70 miles upstream from where the Headless Valley was. He actually built a one-room cabin for himself because he was planning to stay there through the winter. The plan was that he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so, right after he got there, he set up his sluices and started mining for gold. And apparently, he found a lot of it, because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had struck it rich. His partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he had found, because they planned on going back into the valley with him. So, that summer rolled around. His partners went to the designated meeting spot right outside the valley. But Martin never showed up. His partners waited at the meeting spot for several days, until finally, when he still didn't appear, they decided they had to go in there and see if he was okay. At this point, he should have been there. There was no excuse. And so they ended up going into the Nahanni Valley themselves. They made their way up the flat river and went roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier describing his location. And they found his cabin. Or, I should say, they found what was left of his cabin. It had been completely torched, burned to the ground. And lying on the ground next to the burned out structure were the burned out remains of another headless corpse. This corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what had actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the deaths of the two McLeod brothers. Even though they were all decapitated, they were in roughly the same area, and it had all happened within a few years of each other. The cases looked very, very similar. But even with all of that, the police said, no, these are totally separate incidents. They concluded that Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull was missing. Martin's skull was never located. And the gold that Martin had claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin. It wasn't on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy all over again. And despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that had happened close together in a relatively short period of time. And so, a lot of people became convinced that there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in the Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when a gold prospector named John O'Brien and his partner decided that despite the rumors of the so-called killer or whatever was going on, they were going to go into the Nahanni Valley and try their hand at finding gold. And so, the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up a camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found, decapitated. They set up their camp, and they were there for a couple of days. They were doing well. They were finding gold. And then at some point, John told his partner that he was going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and that he would be back in about 8 or 9 days. His partner waited. 8 or 9 days passed, and John didn't come back. A couple more days went by, and now John was officially past due. So, his partner decided he had to go out and look for him. There was another gold prospector in the area, so John's partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream. They eventually found John. He had frozen to death. But it was the way he was positioned that was so interesting. He was sitting upright in front of a campfire that had obviously been lit previously. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in any pain. He just looked like he was enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even still holding a matchbook in his hand. It was as if he was just sitting there, enjoying the warmth of the fire, when something caused him to suddenly freeze solid. In fact, witnesses would later say that John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to the process of freezing to death. The police, when they came out, would say, this is odd. This is a very odd way for him to be positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so, there was no foul play here, and no further investigation was needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the flat river inside of Headless Valley. That night, they were all sitting around the fire, joking around. At some point, they all decided to go to sleep. The next day, when everyone woke up, Annie was no longer in the camp. There was no sign of where she had gone. So they began by yelling out her name and walking around the immediate vicinity to see if maybe she had just stepped away for a minute. But Annie was just gone. No one knew where she went. The hunting party spent the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there was no sign of her. They ultimately had to leave the valley. They told the police came out, and there was a huge search, but Annie was never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near the Flat River near this hunting party when they were there, but was not part of the hunting party himself and didn't know Annie, he was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell the police what he had seen that night out near the Flat River. So he went to the police and he explained that on that night, when he knew there was a hunting party nearby, he could hear them, he knew they were over there, he said at some point he went to bed. Then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. He sat up and looked out across the river. It was totally dark, but there was some moonlight, and he was kind of looking around, wondering what was causing the sound, but he couldn't see anything. And then he heard it again. He could tell it was off to his left. And these weren't huge rocks, they were medium to small-sized rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. He's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple 100 yards away, through some sparse trees, a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up a mountainside. And as she was running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands were knocking little rocks into the river down below. She was right on the edge of this cliff. And as she was running up this hill, she stopped and she turned, and he got a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face, it looked like she was possessed. There was something terribly wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her. Even though he knew that anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds was doomed, he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something very wrong with this woman. The police took his story down and they said, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so it's universally believed that this woman galloping up a hillside in the middle of the night, naked, was Annie Lafferty. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because by the time Charlie was telling them this, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was that she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decided to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He made his way into the valley, he found a spot off the Flat River, and he built a cabin. And then, shortly thereafter, his cabin burned to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was found intact, but the strange thing about his death was that based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof, he should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down. This gave rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire even started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was all just one big, tragic accident. But the vast majority of people who had been following along with all of these strange deaths were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, entered the Headless Valley to try their luck. Shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers' cabin, it had burned to the ground. But William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector, a man named Ernest Savard, entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold. When he did not leave the valley for a planned rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him. They would find him inside of a sleeping bag, lying down, decapitated, right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident. They said he had starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why they couldn't find it. The police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. A search party went in looking for him. John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near the Flat River. Some native tribespeople came into their camp, and they warned them about some strange white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They told the search party that these figures were down near the river, they were out in the forest, they were kind of all around, and that they really needed to be careful. They didn't want the figures to see them. And then the tribespeople just left. The search party was absolutely horrified. They knew about the rumors of this place. They were out here looking for someone who had gone missing in this very place. And all night long, all they heard were distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard on the previous nights. They heard these wailing sounds coming from all around them, as if these things that were out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing in the morning, they got up and they left. The leader of that search party would later say that he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that the constant wailing they heard the night before was a sound he would never forget for the rest of his life. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far fewer strange incidents reported inside of the Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far fewer people have been going into the Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think really happened in the Nahanni Valley down in the comments below. Was there a killer hiding somewhere deep in those forests? Were these just a series of tragic accidents? Or is there really something out there that people still don't understand? Until next time. In 2006, a young man named Dave Murphy had just achieved a lifelong goal. He had become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like any rookie, he was eager to get started, to put his training to use. His very first assignment was as a protective service officer. This role was all about providing physical security for a number of county-owned facilities. It wasn't exactly chasing down bad guys, but it was an important job, and for Dave, it was the first step in his new career. The first facility he was assigned to was the Capital City Theater. This wasn't just any building, it was a landmark in Salt Lake City. It had been standing since the early 1900s, a beautiful, grand, old theater with a rich history. And it was about to become a huge part of Dave's life, in ways he never could have imagined. So, in early August of that year, Dave reported to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job. He was a little nervous, a little excited, ready to learn the ropes. The first person he met was his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. Dave walked in, ready to introduce himself and get to know the guy he'd be spending his nights with. But right away, Dave could tell that Morgan was strictly business. There was no friendly chatter, no welcome to the team. Morgan was all pro, a bit cold, and seemed focused on one thing, the job. The very first thing Morgan did was take Dave to the control room. This room was the nerve center of the theater's security, and it was located on the first floor. The theater itself was a big place, with 3 main floors and a full basement. Inside the control room, a bank of monitors flickered, displaying feeds from security cameras positioned all over the building. Morgan explained that the cameras were old though, their quality was poor. You could really only make out what was happening on screen if a light was on in that specific area. At night, when most of the lights were off, the screens were just fuzzy patches of black and gray. It wasn't an ideal system, but it was what they had. After the brief tour of the control room, Morgan turned to Dave. He said, "Now we're going to go do our rounds." He explained that this was a mandatory procedure. Every single shift, at the very beginning and at the very end, they had to do a full security sweep of the entire building. They had to check every door, make sure every light that was supposed to be off was off, and ensure the entire theater was secure before they could settle in for the night or head home. Morgan led the way, and their first stop was the basement. Dave followed him down a set of stairs, and the moment they stepped onto the basement level, Dave was taken aback. The place was huge. It wasn't just a small storage area, it was a massive, long hallway that stretched out into the dimness seemingly forever. The lighting down there was poor, just a few bare bulbs casting long, eerie shadows. Everything in the building was old, and you could really feel the age of the place in the basement. Right in the middle of this vast, empty hallway, there was a piano. It was just sitting there, a dark, silent shape that seemed completely out of place. Dave remembered thinking how incredibly creepy the whole scene was. This long, shadowy hallway with all these closed doors lining the walls, and this lone piano in the center of it all. An immediate, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. He thought to himself that he really did not want to spend much time down here. But it was part of the job. So, he and Morgan walked the entire length of the hall. They checked every single door, making sure it was locked tight. They then made their way back up, systematically clearing the main floor, then the second floor, and finally the third floor. They checked every room, every closet, every corner. Everything was secure. After the round was complete, they returned to the control room. Dave was hoping that now, with the initial tour out of the way, he might get to know Morgan a bit. This was his partner, after all. They were going to be relying on each other for long hours in this empty building. But Morgan remained cold and distant. He barely spoke to Dave, offering only short, direct answers to any questions. It was clear he did not want to make small talk. And as their shift neared its end, Dave noticed that Morgan seemed almost desperate to get the final security round over with and just get out of the building. At the end of that first night, Dave drove home with a strange feeling. There was just something off about Morgan's behavior. It wasn't just that he was quiet, it was more than that. It felt like Morgan genuinely hated being in that theater. Dave had a gut feeling he was onto something. And it would turn out he was absolutely right. Morgan did not like being in that building, but it would take a little while before he was willing to tell Dave the reason why. For the next couple of days, Dave and Morgan did their security rounds together. Dave was still in training, so Morgan was showing him the exact procedure for securing every part of the massive building. Then, on August 9th, just 2 days after Dave's first shift, Morgan decided Dave was ready to handle it on his own. At the end of their shift, as it was time for the final sweep, Morgan told Dave to do the security round by himself. Dave felt confident. He'd done it a few times now and knew the layout. He started in the basement, just like they always did. He walked down that long, creepy hall, checking each door handle, making sure the lights were off. He finished the basement and went up to the first floor where the control room was. He checked all the rooms there, then moved into the main auditorium space. He walked through the rows of empty seats, checking all the little nooks and crannies to make sure no one was hiding out. From there, he went up to the second floor. He checked the rooms there, walked along the balcony overlooking the stage, and then made his way to the third and final floor. The third floor housed the offices for the theater's staff. At the very end of his search, the last room he needed to check was the rehearsal room. This room was a bit different from the others. It didn't have a door. It was just an open doorway. The procedure was simple: poke your head in, look around to make sure it was empty, and then move on. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room. He reaches in and flips the light switch on. The room floods with light. He scans it quickly, it's empty. Satisfied, he flips the light back off and turns to head back into the hallway to finish his shift. But just as he's turning, he hears an incredibly loud noise. A door right across the hallway from him slams shut with tremendous force. It was the bathroom door. His police instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was that someone must have been hiding in the building. They had been in the bathroom, saw him coming, and made a run for it, slamming the door behind them as they tried to escape. He instinctively grabbed his radio. He called down to Morgan in the control room, his voice tense. "Someone's on the third floor," he said. Morgan immediately looked at the camera feed for the third-floor hallway. But he didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. Back on the third floor, Dave had already drawn his weapon. He was looking up and down the long hall, but he saw nothing. As he stood there, waiting for Morgan to come up and provide backup so they could search for this person, two things suddenly clicked in his mind. First, just because he heard the door slam didn't mean the person had run out. They could still be inside the bathroom. Maybe they slammed it from the inside to hide. He thought to himself, that's why Morgan can't see them on the camera. They're still in there. The second thing he realized sent a chill down his spine. That bathroom door, it couldn't slam. It was a heavy door fitted with a big, powerful hydraulic hinge, the kind that makes a door close slowly and silently. It was physically impossible for it to slam shut with that kind of force. His gun was now aimed directly at the bathroom door. A moment later, Morgan came up the stairs and appeared at his side. He saw the situation and drew his own pistol, aiming it at the door as well. They wordlessly agreed on a plan. On a count, they made entry, bursting into the bathroom, ready for a confrontation. They cleared every stall, every corner. But there was no one there. And there was no other way out. No windows, no vents big enough for a person. It was a dead end. Morgan and Dave were baffled. They figured the person must have run out after all and was now hiding somewhere else in the theater. They decided they weren't going to worry about how the door managed to slam. They just knew they had an intruder to find. So, with their guns still drawn, they left the bathroom and began a systematic search of the third floor. They checked every office, every closet. Every single door was still locked, just as Dave had left them. As they started making their way down the stairs to the second floor, Dave noticed something through the window in the stairwell door. The lights on the second floor were on. He remembered distinctly turning them all off just a few minutes ago. As they were walking down the stairs, he asked Morgan, "Hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor?" Morgan said no, he hadn't touched a thing. Their intruder, they thought, must be on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They pushed through the door, ready for anything. And they found that not only were all the lights on, but every single door on the second floor had been opened. Doors that Dave had personally checked and closed just minutes before were now standing wide open. They searched the entire second floor, room by room. They found nothing. No one was there. They methodically went through, turning off all the lights again and shutting and locking all the doors. They went down to the first floor. Everything there was exactly as it should be, lights off, doors locked. Then they descended back into the creepy basement. The tension was high now. They had searched almost the entire building and were expecting to finally come face to face with whoever was playing these games with them. But they found no one in the basement either. The entire theater was empty. Confused and on edge, they went back to the control room. They decided to review the security footage from the third floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone running down the hall when the door slammed. But the camera angle wasn't great. It was pointed down the hall, but you couldn't see the bathroom door itself. And of course, the hallway was dark, and the old cameras were useless without light. All they could see on the footage was the light from the rehearsal room turning on as Dave did his check. Then, a few seconds later, the light turned off. The screen went nearly black. And then, through the audio feed, they heard it. A massive, echoing slam. But they couldn't see what caused it. They had no explanation. They were both on edge, convinced someone could still be hiding somewhere. They did another full sweep of the entire building, just to be sure. Again, they found nothing. In the end, they had no choice but to chalk it up to something strange and unexplainable. Maybe they were just hearing things, seeing things. They decided to just get out of there and go home. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan was working a shift alone. Dave had the night off. Morgan was sitting in the control room monitoring the quiet building when he thought he heard something. It sounded like whispering coming from the hallway just behind him. After the experience with the slamming door a few nights earlier, he was already on high alert. He didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and stood up. He stepped out into the hallway, and as soon as he did, the whispering sound seemed to move, getting farther and farther away from him down the hall. He looked around, but the hall was empty. He cautiously made his way down the hallway towards the main stairwell that led either up to the second floor or down into the basement. When he got to the top of the stairs, guns still raised, he listened. And that's when he heard a new sound. It was the distinct sound of someone coughing, and it was coming from the basement. At this point, Morgan would later admit that he was genuinely scared. Imagine being all alone in this massive, old theater. Just a few days ago, you had a bizarre experience with slamming doors and mysterious open rooms, something another police officer witnessed with you. Now, you're by yourself, hearing voices and coughing coming from the creepiest part of the building. It was terrifying. He very slowly started to make his way down the stairs, his heart pounding. He was getting ready to clear the corner and confront whoever was down there. But just as he reached the bottom of the stairwell, the coughing stopped. He flipped on the lights for the basement hall. He looked down the long, empty corridor. There was nothing there. He started making his way down the hall, checking every door, just like he and Dave always did. He got all the way to the far end of the basement, and as he was finishing his check, he suddenly smelled smoke. A strong, distinct smell of something burning. It was coming from a door right next to him. Thinking there was a fire, he quickly unlocked the door and went inside. But the room was empty. There was no fire. He turned the light on, looked everywhere, but there was nothing burning. The smell of smoke, however, was overwhelming. He was now convinced that there had to be a fire somewhere in the basement. He started going into every single room, one by one, searching for the source. But he found nothing. And then, as mysteriously as it had started, the smell of smoke just dissipated. It was gone. He did a full check of the entire theater, every floor, every room, looking for any sign of a fire. There was nothing. He thought about calling the fire department, but what would he tell them? That he smelled smoke for a few minutes, but now there's no fire? He checked the building 3 or 4 more times just to be absolutely sure. Confident there was no fire, he just had to accept that he couldn't explain it. He was smelling things that weren't there. A few weeks went by. On September 4th, Dave arrived for his shift a little early. It started at 5 p.m., but he got to the theater around 4:30. As he walked in, he saw 3 staff members sitting at the front desk just chatting. As he walked past, he overheard one of them talking about ghosts inside the theater. This immediately got his attention. He walked over to the man who was talking and introduced himself. The man's name was Blair Fuller, and he was a senior accountant for the theater. Dave told him that he handled security for the building and that he had experienced some strange things himself. He asked Blair if he would be willing to share what he knew. Blair agreed, and they headed up to his office on the 3rd floor. They sat down, and Blair said, "Okay, I've got a doozy for you." He told Dave that a couple of years ago he had been working late in this very office. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. As he was working, he heard the building's elevator kick on. The elevator was right outside his office, and it was an old, loud machine. It was really obvious whenever it was moving. He didn't think much of it at first. But then it clicked. He was the only person in the entire building. He looked out through the glass window of his office door. He could see the little lights above the elevator door that showed which floor it was on. The lights were lit up, and they were moving. The elevator was coming up from the basement. It passed the first floor, then the second. Finally, it arrived at the third floor. The doors slid open. There was no one inside. Blair said that at this point, he still wasn't too concerned. He figured maybe it was some kind of scheduled maintenance or an automatic cycle it ran at night. But after a little while, a loud alarm started going off in the elevator. It was the alarm that sounds when something is blocking the door, preventing it from closing. He looked out his office window again. He could hear the ringing sound, but he could clearly see that there was nothing obstructing the doorway. The doors were just stuck open. Curious, he left his office and walked over to the elevator. He stepped inside. He said that the moment he set foot in the elevator car, he felt a massive sudden drop in temperature. It was ice cold inside. As he was standing there, he turned around to look back towards his office. And then the elevator doors started to close. He said that for whatever reason, he didn't step out. He just decided to ride it out and see what happened. As soon as the doors closed, the button for the basement lit up, as if someone had pressed it. The elevator began its descent. He was just standing there thinking about how bizarre this all was. The elevator was malfunctioning with an alarm just a moment ago, and now, as soon as he got inside, it was working perfectly and taking him to the basement. The elevator reached the basement, and the doors opened. There was no one there. Blair said it took all of his courage, but he called out, "Hey, is anyone down here?" He was met with total silence. As soon as he realized no one was going to answer, he said he didn't want to make another sound. He was standing in the elevator in the middle of that long, dark basement hall with the piano sitting out in the middle of it. The lights in the hall were off, and the only light was spilling out from the elevator car. He poked his head out and looked one way. Nothing. He looked the other way. Nothing but the faint outline of the piano. At this point, he was completely spooked. He jumped back into the elevator and started frantically pressing the button for the third floor. He was hitting the door close button over and over. The doors finally shut, and the elevator took him back up to his office. He rushed into his office, shut the door behind him, and sat down at his desk, his mind racing. He was trying to rationalize what had just happened. As he was sitting there, trying to calm down, he heard a new noise. It sounded like banging, coming from just outside his office in the foyer area near the elevator. He got up, went to his door, and cautiously opened it. He peeked his head out and looked to the side. There was a big heavy metal filing cabinet there, and all of its drawers were pulled wide open. He definitely had not done that. And as he watched, one by one, the heavy drawers began to slam shut on their own. Bang. 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 One after another until the entire cabinet was closed. He walked over to it, trying to disprove what he had just seen. He thought maybe there was a problem with the drawers, that they would just shut on their own. But he opened one, and it stayed open. He had to physically push it for it to close. Something, or someone, had just slammed them all shut. That was it for him. He packed up his things, left the theater, and swore he would never work another night shift there again. Later that night, Dave told Morgan the story that Blair had shared with him. He wasn't sure how Morgan would react, if he'd be dismissive. But, to his surprise, Morgan opened up. He told Dave that long before Dave had started working there, he had always had this uncomfortable feeling in the theater, like he was constantly being watched. And then he reminded Dave of their shared experience with the slamming bathroom door and the lights on the second floor. Then Morgan told him about his solo shift. He described hearing the voices in the hall, the coughing from the basement, and the inexplicable smell of smoke when there was no fire. They started going back and forth, sharing all the strange, unsettling things they had experienced in that building. They both felt deeply uncomfortable there, and they realized they needed to do something. Dave came up with an idea. He said he had a best friend he could invite over one night. They would tell him they were just giving him a special behind-the-scenes tour of the historic theater. They wouldn't tell him about any of the strange events. They would just walk him through and see if he noticed anything, if he reacted to anything. It would be a way to see if they were just imagining things, to get an outside perspective. Morgan thought it was a good idea. So Dave called his best friend, a guy named Greg. Greg would later say he was a bit surprised to get an invitation for a late-night tour of the theater, but he was curious. Since it was his best friend asking, he agreed to come down and check it out. The next day, Greg showed up at the theater where Dave and Morgan were on shift. They started the tour. They showed him the main auditorium, the stage, the dressing rooms. Then they made their way down to the basement. Morgan went first and flipped on the lights. And instantly, both he and Dave saw it. A little way down the hall, on the left, one of the doors was standing open. This was a huge red flag. No doors were ever left open. Dave and Morgan immediately pushed Greg behind them for safety, and they both drew their pistols, aiming them at the open doorway. Greg stayed back as Dave and Morgan slowly and cautiously advanced down the hall towards the open door. They got right up to the doorway, preparing to push the door open and clear the room. But before they could touch it, the door slammed shut right in front of their faces. Greg, Dave, and Morgan all just stared at it, completely shocked. And before they could even process that, the door handle started rattling violently, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get out. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The hallway was silent again. Dave and Morgan looked at each other and nodded. They had to go in. Greg was terrified of being left alone in the hallway, so he decided to follow them. The three of them entered the room, Dave and Morgan with their guns raised. It was a small storage room. They flipped on the light. There was no one there. Suddenly, Greg gasped and pointed to a corner of the room. He said, "Someone sitting in the corner?" Dave and Morgan immediately swung their guns towards the corner, but there was nothing there. It was empty. Greg insisted. "I just saw someone sitting there," he said, his voice trembling. It looked like he had a hood on, like a sweatshirt. He was right there. Now, all three of them were completely freaked out. Dave and Morgan had brought Greg there hoping to disprove the strangeness, and instead it had escalated. All three of them had seen a door slam shut, and Greg was now claiming to have seen a figure in the room. This scared them all badly. They quickly left the room, locked it, shut off the lights, and got out of the basement. Greg said he was done, and left immediately. Dave and Morgan were left standing there wondering what on earth they were supposed to do now. At this point, Dave and Morgan started reporting these strange occurrences. They didn't mention anything about ghosts or hauntings, of course. They framed it as a series of potential break-ins and security breaches. Eventually, the county agreed that something needed to be done and decided to install a brand new, upgraded camera system inside the theater. These new cameras had infrared technology, which meant they could see much more clearly in the dark. The hope was that this new system would finally allow them to catch whoever was breaking in and causing all this trouble. The new cameras were installed on September 15th. That night, Morgan was working alone again. He was sitting in the control room, familiarizing himself with the new system, clicking through the different camera feeds, and testing out the new features. At some point, as he was looking at the monitor for the main auditorium, something caught his eye. It looked like someone might be sitting in one of the seats out in the middle of the empty theater. The camera was zoomed out so he couldn't get a clear look. And since it was his first time using these new cameras, he wasn't sure what was normal and what wasn't. He zoomed the camera in, trying to get a better look. He could now see it more clearly. It was a figure, and it seemed to be wearing a hood or some kind of shroud over its head. It was just sitting there, motionless. And then it slowly started to turn its head from side to side. As it turned, he could see, clear as day, a set of eyes glowing in the infrared view. And before Morgan could even react, the figure just started to rise up into the air, floating straight up towards the ceiling until it completely disappeared from view. That was it for Morgan. He didn't investigate. He didn't go looking. He was done. He literally quit his job that day. That was his very last shift at the Capital City Theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan quit, Dave was now working alone at the theater. He was in the control room one night when suddenly he heard the sound of a piano playing. There was only one piano in the entire theater. The one in the basement. As a police officer, it was his job to protect the building. He knew he had to go down there and check it out. It could be an intruder. He left the control room, drew his weapon, and started walking towards the basement stairs. As he got closer, the piano music got louder and louder. He made his way down the steps, and just as he was about to round the corner into the main basement hallway, he heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the wooden guard that protects the piano keys slamming shut. And the music stopped. He turned the corner and looked down the long hallway. There was no one there. He flipped on the light. The hall was empty. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going to find anyone. He knew this was the same thing that had been causing all the mayhem in the theater for months. Dave had seen enough. He was done with this place. He went right back upstairs, locked himself in the control room, and stayed there until the end of his shift. The very next day, he went to his sergeant and said, "You can never put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And sure enough, he was transferred. For the next 2 months, the theater didn't have a full-time security officer. Different officers would come in for a few hours here and there, but no one was assigned there permanently. That is, until November 26th. The department found another officer, a veteran cop named Josh Thomas, who agreed to take the full-time post at the theater. On November 26th, Josh Thomas reported for his very first shift. Because there had been no permanent officer, there was no one there to show him the ropes. He was all alone in the theater. By pure coincidence, Dave happened to be on patrol in his car that night, and his route took him near the theater. At some point during the night, a call came over Dave's radio. It was Josh. He was calling for backup, saying someone had broken into the theater. Dave's heart sank. He knew it probably wasn't a break-in. He knew exactly what was going on in that building. He was the closest unit to the theater, and even though the last thing he ever wanted to do was go back there, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had to go and back Josh up. And if it was what he thought it was, he needed to be the one to explain to this new officer what he was getting himself into. When Dave arrived at the theater, he went to the back door they always used. He saw Josh standing just outside the building. Dave would later say that Josh's eyes were as wide as saucers. He looked absolutely terrified. Dave walked over to him and asked what was going on, if the intruder was still inside. Josh explained that he had been doing his security rounds when he heard what sounded like voices coming from the basement. He checked all the rooms, but everything was secure. Then, as he made his way up to the 3rd floor, he saw that the elevator had turned on. It was coming up from the basement. The light was on, and he could hear it whirring. When the elevator doors opened on his floor, there was no one there. He stood there, looking at the empty car, and then the door obstruction alarm started going off. That's when he called for backup. Dave looked at him and said, "Look, let's just go search the building. We'll do it together." They went inside and cleared the entire theater, floor by floor. Of course, they found no one. Before Dave left, they went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage, just talking. Dave's back was to the audience seats, and Josh was facing him. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, Josh just stopped talking. He froze, and he was staring at something just over Dave's shoulder. Dave asked, "What is it?" And Josh, his voice barely a whisper, said, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turned around. And as soon as he did, he saw what Josh was looking at. Standing in the very back of the dark theater, in a corner, was a man. His hands were by his sides, and his back was to them. He seemed to be looking down, and he had a hood pulled over his head. Dave turned his whole body to face this figure. And right as he did, the figure whipped around and looked directly at them. It had deep, dark, sunken eyes. Its face looked as if it had been horribly burned. It was black and charred. It stared at them for a second, and then it turned and ran out of a door at the back of the theater. Josh was convinced they had just seen the intruder. Dave was fairly certain they had just seen the entity that haunted the theater. They searched the entire building again, but they never found the cloaked figure. That was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room. He told him everything. He told him about the slamming doors, the voices, the smoke. He told him Blair's story about the elevator and the filing cabinets. He told him why Morgan had quit and why he himself had quit. Josh was now up to speed. Great, he thought. I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time Dave would ever set foot in the Capital City Theater. But his curiosity got the better of him. He started doing some research into the history of the building, and what he found was chilling. It turned out that back in the 1940s, there had been a horrible fire in the theater. A man had been trapped in the basement when the fire erupted. He had died down there. Dave shared this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them, all police officers, all trained to look in strong logical explanations, came to believe the same thing. They believed that what they had been witnessing, what they had seen and heard, was the ghost of the man who died in that fire all those years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to 2 different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth. Which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her, point blank, if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking, because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because, as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled, and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kennetock mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So, Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christy were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her coworkers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then, Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight, and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang. But when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christy eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to 2 different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the evening of the 28th of December 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt was driving his truck down a highway heading into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The lights of the city were just beginning to glow against the darkening desert sky. Next to him, his 11-year-old daughter Sienna was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. They had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, a long, quiet drive all the way from his mother's home in California. They had just spent Christmas there. But it hadn't really been a very happy holiday. A few weeks earlier, Don's sister Janice had passed away from breast cancer. And Janice was one of the last truly close family members Don had left. His father was gone, his other sister was gone too, and he wasn't even on speaking terms with his younger brother, Dennis. They'd had a huge argument the year before, and things had never been the same. So when Don got the news about Janice, he knew he had to be with his mom. He immediately called his ex-wife and arranged to take Sienna with him for the trip. He really wished they could have stayed in California a little longer, but he had to get back to work. Don worked at an agency that provided services for people who were developmentally disabled, and there was a big, important meeting coming up that he just could not miss. His job was important to him. It was a way of giving back, of doing good in the world, something he had come to value more and more over the years. Just then, the brake lights of the car in front of him flashed bright red. Don slammed on his own brakes, bringing the truck to a sudden stop. Traffic was piling up, everything grinding to a halt for no apparent reason. He felt that old, familiar surge of anger rise up in his chest. It was a hot, prickly feeling he knew all too well. He laid on the horn, a long, frustrated blast. He was just about to roll down the window to yell something at the driver in front of him, but then he glanced over at Sienna. She had opened her eyes, startled by the sudden stop and the noise. Seeing the alarm on her face was enough to make him stop. He took a deep breath. He reminded himself that it was just traffic. It wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have a pretty bad temper when he was behind the wheel, a real case of road rage. But in recent years, he'd been working really hard to control it. He wanted to set a better example for his daughter. So he just sat there, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the traffic to move. Finally, the cars ahead started to inch forward. As he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through the familiar streets of downtown Albuquerque, Don made a conscious effort to shift his focus to something positive. He thought about the upcoming weekend. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And the thought of Spaghetti Sunday always made Don smile. It was a tradition he and Sienna had started together a few years back. Every Sunday, right after church, they would go home and cook up huge batches of spaghetti and meatballs. Then they'd pack it all up and take it downtown to feed the homeless community. At first, it had just been the two of them, a father and daughter with a big pot of pasta. But, over time, word had spread. More people had started to join in, bringing their own food or dropping off donations of clothes and canned goods. Before long, it had grown into a real community event, with whole groups of volunteers showing up every week. Don was so proud of what he'd created, but he was especially proud that he had done it with Sienna, teaching her the importance of kindness and compassion. Finally, Don turned down his own quiet residential street. He pulled into the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse. It was still decorated with Christmas lights, their cheerful colors a little out of place with the sadness he was feeling. He turned off the engine, and the garage fell silent. He got out of the car, woke Sienna up gently, and then grabbed their suitcases from the back. They walked to the front door, and he fumbled for his keys in his pocket. He unlocked the door, and as his daughter stepped inside, she let out a huge shriek of pure excitement. Don smiled. Waiting for her right there under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle, a shiny bow tied to the handlebars. She spun around, her eyes wide, and asked if she could please take it for a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes. He loved seeing her so happy. But it was already dark outside, and this was only supposed to be a quick stop. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 o'clock. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday week, and he was supposed to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a civil relationship for the most part, but he knew she'd be annoyed if he was late or if he tried to ask for more time. They had a schedule, and it was important to stick to it. So, Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait. He promised they could ride it all weekend. For now, he just needed her to go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would head out. As Sienna ran upstairs, Don noticed something strange. His golden retriever, Buddy, hadn't come to greet him. Normally, the dog would be all over him, tail wagging, jumping up the second he heard the key in the door. It was unusual. So, Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name. He finally found the dog cowering in the master bedroom, tucked away in a corner. Don extended his hand, and Buddy came forward, but he was skittish, sniffing his hand cautiously. This was really unnerving for Don. Buddy never acted scared of him. But then again, Don had been gone for a while. He told himself it was probably just separation anxiety. The dog missed him. So he gave Buddy a gentle pat on the head, made sure his bowl was full of kibble, and then grabbed his keys again. It was time for the short drive over to Christine's house. Don drove very slowly through the neighborhood, trying to savor every last minute with Sienna. He treasured this time with his daughter more than anything. The mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost cost him the chance to be her father. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life. He went to church every Sunday, he ran his charity, he was a pillar of the community. But it hadn't always been that way. He had partied a lot in his youth. When Sienna was just a toddler, he'd had his dream job as a firefighter, but he'd lost it after failing a drug test. After he lost that job, the financial strain on his marriage to Christine became too much. She had to shoulder most of the bills, and the resentment built up. After a few months, Christine filed for divorce. It was a crushing blow for Don. But what was even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don already had 2 older kids from a previous marriage. After that divorce, his first wife had been given sole custody, and she had moved them all to Oklahoma. As a result, Don had barely seen them while they were growing up. It was one of the biggest regrets of his life. He was absolutely determined not to let that happen again with Sienna. So, he'd gone to court. He fought Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten ugly at times, really contentious, but in the end, it was worth it. Don made the most of every single moment he got to spend with his daughter. He was the dad who would braid her hair before school. He was the dad who would stay up late making elaborate costumes for her school plays. And on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he never, ever forgot to call her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway. Christine was already outside, standing by the front door with her arms crossed. As he got out of the car, she pointedly motioned to her watch. She was clearly annoyed that he was late. Don walked over and sort of apologized, explaining that it had been a really long drive from California. He told her they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and then they'd hit all that traffic coming into the city. Christine just sighed and said it was okay. She asked how the trip was, and Don told her it went as well as it could. They'd had a nice Christmas despite the sadness hanging over everything because of his sister's death. He said it had been meaningful just for the family to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and a kiss. He told her he loved her and promised to call her before bed, just like always. And he reminded her that when he saw her again that weekend, they would have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his own garage just 10 minutes later, he noticed that the big plastic trash can at the end of his driveway was lying on its side, overturned. He figured the wind must have knocked it over. So he parked his truck, got out, and walked down to the curb to flip it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed the button on the wall to close the garage door, and unlocked the interior door that led into his townhouse. As he was inside, taking off his shoes and his jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing. He thought he heard it start to roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the safety sensor at the bottom. He paused, listening intently. And then what he heard was the sound of the door closing again, this time hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. He shook his head. He must have been imagining things. He was tired from the long drive. His mind was playing tricks on him. Don dragged his suitcase into his bedroom and started to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and try not to think about anything for a while. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he looked up and saw a small, ugly hole in the ceiling. He let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months. He had really been hoping it would finally be done by the time he got home. He made a mental note to give the landlord yet another angry call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on. He headed out to the garage to have a cigarette before bed. It was his routine, a quiet moment to himself at the end of a long day. The following morning, on December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk with a cup of coffee when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up. It was Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna sounded worried. She told Valerie that her dad hadn't called her last night to say goodnight. She asked if he was there at the office now. Valerie stood up and peered over the cubicle wall at Don's desk. It was empty. His computer was off. This was a little unusual. Don was a very punctual guy. He was always one of the first people in the office. But it was still early. So she told Sienna not to worry. She said she would give Don a call right now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back as soon as he got the message. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. That was also strange. So she sent him a text message, just asking if everything was okay. She waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. He hadn't shown up at the office either. And now, Valerie was starting to feel a real sense of concern. It was not like Don to just skip work without calling in. And it was definitely not like him to ignore calls and texts, especially if he knew his daughter was trying to reach him. Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they both agreed that something felt wrong. They decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. Maybe he had just overslept, or maybe his phone had died. They hoped it was something simple. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy as Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked, but to her surprise, the door just swung open under the pressure of her hand. It hadn't been latched properly. She looked over at her coworker, a nervous expression on her face. Then the two of them cautiously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but there was no answer. The house was quiet. So she started to wander through the living room, peeking into the bedroom on the first floor. The house seemed empty. Her coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor. Valerie decided she would check the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. If the truck was gone, maybe he just had an early morning appointment he forgot to mention. Valerie opened the door that led from the kitchen into the two-car garage. She flipped on the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered on, and she saw Don's truck parked in its usual spot. But as her eyes scanned the garage, something else caught her attention. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV that also parked in the shared space, she noticed a streak of something dark red. It ran down the wall. At this point, Valerie's heart started to pound in her chest. She was feeling pretty nervous, but she knew she had to see what it was. She began walking slowly toward that back wall, her eyes fixed on the dark streak. She was wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, if it was just paint or rust. As she got closer and closer, the streak came into sharper focus. Finally, she was close enough that she could actually look down into the narrow space between the back of the SUV and that red-streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, an Albuquerque police detective named Matthew Kaplan pulled his unmarked car up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse. The whole property was already secured with yellow crime scene tape, and police officers were swarming the area. Two women in business clothes were sitting on the curb, their faces stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew so far was that a man had been found dead in the garage attached to this townhouse. And now, he was the lead investigator on the case. So, he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door. A uniformed officer standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more of the details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Flewitt. The two women sitting outside were his coworkers. They had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. The officer also told him there were no signs of forced entry. The women had said the front door was unlocked, just slightly ajar when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse, into the living room. The first thing he saw was a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. It looked like it hadn't even been ridden yet. Then he did a slow, methodical loop through the first and second floors. He noted there was a cell phone lying on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter full of cash and credit cards. It didn't look like anything had been rifled through. None of the drawers in the house were hanging open. The place was generally neat and orderly. On first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan to be a robbery gone wrong. Back on the first floor, Kaplan pushed open the door to the garage. Crime scene techs were already busy inside, their cameras flashing as they photographed the scene and collected forensic samples. Kaplan carefully stepped around them and knelt down next to Dawn's body. It was lying face up, wedged in the small space between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat had been cut. It was a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other. There were also smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, on his ear, and on his hands, defensive wounds, as if he had tried to fight back against his attacker. There were also clear signs of blunt force trauma to his head, as if he had been hit repeatedly with a heavy object, something like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked very closely at Dawn's eyes, he saw tiny red dots, burst capillaries on his eyeballs and eyelids. He knew from experience that these were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent, almost overkill. It was gruesome. And Kaplan knew that kind of rage usually meant the murder was personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the rest of the scene. There was blood spattered on the walls and on a small refrigerator that stood next to the body. There were also bloody handprints smeared on the side of Dawn's own truck. But there was no large pool of blood on the concrete floor around Dawn's body. In fact, the floor looked strangely clean. It looked like somebody had recently mopped it, like they had tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty plastic bottle of bleach sitting on top of the washing machine nearby. His eyes narrowed. He walked over, he opened up the lid of the washer, and sure enough, he found a pile of wet towels inside. They still smelled strongly of bleach. The killer had stayed. They had taken the time to try and clean the scene. Just then, a crime scene tech came over, carrying a bottle of luminol spray. Luminol is a chemical that law enforcement uses to detect trace amounts of blood even after it's been cleaned up. It reacts with the iron and hemoglobin and glows a faint blue in the dark. Kaplan stepped back so the tech could spray the area. He followed him as he made his way through the garage and then back into the house. The luminol spray did indeed pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and inside the kitchen sink. Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage, and then they had come inside to wash their hands, or maybe even the murder weapon, in the kitchen sink before they left. But it's much, much harder to completely scrub a murder scene than most people realize. And so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually be able to recover some of the killer's DNA from the scene. Kaplan stepped out through the front door just as another car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car, looking agitated. He pushed right past the yellow crime scene tape, and Kaplan immediately put his hands up to stop him. The man looked totally flustered. He introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord. He asked what on earth the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped. Then he started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father, a deeply religious man who would open up his home to anyone. He said that nobody would ever want to kill Don. But then Benny paused. He made a face, like a thought was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did a lot of charity work with the city's homeless population. And he said it was possible that maybe somebody from the street could have followed Don home, broken into his house, and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny and sent him on his way, he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what the landlord had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder and the fact that nothing of value appeared to have been stolen, he doubted very much that this was just a random break-in by a homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew. Maybe even someone who had a key to the house, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big, muscular guy, and it was clear from the defensive wounds that he had fought back hard against his attacker. Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially large male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan drove to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had already spoken to Christine on the phone the day before just to break the terrible news about her ex-husband's death and to see if she had any idea who might have done this. Christine hadn't had any specific ideas about who would want to hurt Don, but she had mentioned that he used to have a big problem with road rage. She pointed out that he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe, she suggested, he had gotten into some kind of confrontation with another driver on the highway, and maybe they had gotten angry enough to follow him home. But she also said their daughter Sienna had been with him for the whole drive, and Sienna hadn't mentioned anything like that happening. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had told her his dog Buddy was acting really skittish and scared when he had gotten back from the road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine herself as a suspect. She had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at her house around 7:45 on the night he was killed, and Christine and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together, at home. Her road rage theory seemed about as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but it wasn't particularly helpful in identifying a suspect right now. But Kaplan was back at Christine's house today because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry. Terry had been out of town for work the night before. He was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Don's ex-wife, he was a natural person of interest. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite, easy smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting. He said a quick hello to them and then asked if they could leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in a big armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed very calm, almost relaxed, and he was friendly as he told the detective that he and Don didn't really have much contact with each other. He said their relationship wasn't exactly bad, it was just awkward. He explained it was because of the very difficult custody battle Don had had with Christine a few years back. Ever since then, Terry said he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Don as much as possible. He said he knew that Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked some kind of conflict with Don, Sienna would likely take her dad's side, and he didn't want that. As for the night of Don's murder, Terry told Kaplan that he was at his sister's house until about 9 o'clock that evening. Then he left her place and stopped at a Wendy's on his way to work to grab a burger. After that, he said he took a nap in the cab of his truck in the company parking lot before going in for his overnight shift. After Kaplan left Terry and Christine's house, he went back to the station. He immediately called Terry's sister, and then he called Terry's boss at the trucking company. And they both confirmed Terry's story. His sister said he left her house around 9. His boss confirmed he clocked in for his shift later that night. It seemed that Terry's alibi was solid. And that meant Kaplan was right back to square one with no viable suspects. But while he was sitting at his desk, writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang. It was a call from one of Don's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her home security camera for the night of Don's murder, and she had found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence. He grabbed his keys and drove right over to the neighbor's house. She led him inside to her computer and pressed play on a video file. Kaplan leaned in close to the computer screen. He watched the grainy black and white footage. The camera was mounted on her house, and it showed the side of Don's townhouse shot from the top of her driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., which Kaplan knew was just a few minutes after Don and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a dark, hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure walked over and deliberately tipped over Don's trash can. Then the figure walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen, presumably hiding somewhere out of view. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn's truck pulling into the garage. Then it showed Dawn walking back out again to go pick up the overturned trash can. He set it upright, and then he walked back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in the camera's frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light start to dim, which meant the garage door was closing. But then, inexplicably, the light began to get bigger again, which meant the door must have started going back up. And at the exact same time, there were several brief flashes of light, like a strobe. And then, after those flashes, the light began to dim again, meaning the garage door finally closed all the way, eventually leaving the driveway in total darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video from the neighbor. Then he left her house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what he had just seen on that video. He stood inside of Dawn's empty garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand. He pressed the button to close the door. And as the heavy door began its descent, Kaplan walked closer and closer until he was standing almost directly underneath its path. And when he did that, all of a sudden, the door stopped. Kaplan had tripped the infrared safety sensor at the bottom. And as soon as he tripped that sensor, a light on the motor unit at the top of the garage flashed 3 times, just as the door not only stopped, but reversed direction and began going back up. It was clearly the system's safety feature. And once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he had seen in the neighbor's video. And he thought about that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage just moments before Dawn got home. And all at once, it was like the pieces of the puzzle just clicked into place. The suspect must have waited for Dawn to go inside. And then, as the garage door was closing, they must have tried to sneak into the garage. But when they did, they must have tripped that sensor. So, the door would have stopped, those lights would have flashed, and the door would have started to go back up again. But the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what was going on, must have rushed over to the control panel on the wall and quickly hit the button again to make the door shut all the way. It was a close call for the killer. And it meant Dawn was none the wiser that someone else was now in the garage with him. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage was, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on the security video. It was too grainy and the person was wearing a hood. But the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They must have known when he would be leaving to take Sienna to her mother's house, and they must have known approximately when he would be coming back home alone. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, wouldn't just ignore it and leave it for the morning. They knew he would deal with it right then and there. And while Dawn was down at the curb, busy with the trash can, that would give the killer the perfect opportunity to sneak into the garage undetected. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn, they had to have known him very, very well. Detective Kaplan spent the next several weeks speaking to absolutely everyone who knew Dawn. He talked to his coworkers, his friends from church, and his entire extended family. He even tracked down his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said that they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad over the years. However, they said that wasn't true for some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan that the person he should really be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a huge falling out about a year earlier. But somehow, right after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over all of Dawn's affairs ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the rest of the family that he was just trying to be helpful. But Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January of 2017, nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Detective Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. Seated across the bare interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up. He was fidgety. but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or just irritated about it because he was innocent and being hassled. Dennis told Kaplan that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015, a little over a year earlier. He said the family had reached an agreement about what to do with their dad's possessions. But Don had apparently violated that agreement by keeping one of their father's classic cars for himself instead of selling it and splitting the money like they had all agreed. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said he and Don were no longer on speaking terms at all. Dennis claimed that he had reached out to Don that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Don never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that at some point they could patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Don was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished his explanation. He didn't really buy the whole reconciliation story. And Dennis's only alibi for the night of the murder was that he was home alone. That wasn't an alibi at all. So Kaplan decided to push him a little harder. He asked Dennis why he had started rooting through Don's house the very minute the crime scene tape came down. At this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to go through his brother's things themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Don's affairs had actually led him to a new lead about the murder, a lead that he wanted Kaplan to look into. He said that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, just standing there inside, with no good explanation for what he was doing. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole in the ceiling that the landlord was supposed to repair, but hadn't gotten around to yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into an active crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair. He remembered Benny Ruiz showing up at the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence at all, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself from the very beginning. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz, the landlord, into the station for an interview. Just like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. He said he was at home. But he did have an explanation for why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed Don's dog Buddy because nobody else was looking after the poor animal during the first few chaotic days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there was one person he should really be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived from out of town, he had been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse just a few blocks away from Don's. And Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it. He said he wanted to move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this whole thing very strange. When he ran a routine background check on Dennis, he discovered that he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no, he couldn't rent the place. Now, Kaplan already knew about Dennis's criminal record because he had run his name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of complete estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in taking over his brother's life and raising his daughter. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer. But there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don Fluitt as a loving father and a man of faith, a man who had completely reformed himself after some serious mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with him over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off years ago. And both she and her new husband, Terry, had alibis that seemed to check out. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. There just didn't seem to be anybody in his life who truly wanted Don dead. In February, about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article about the case. The headline said that the police had no suspects and no solid evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit to himself that it was more or less the truth. The investigation had hit a wall. The breakthrough that Detective Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, a full 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the state forensics lab. They told him that the results from a key piece of evidence had just come in, and the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on all the forensic evidence, the dozens of interviews, and the police investigation, here is what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of the 28th of December 2016. The killer waited in the darkness, right outside of Don's house, until the garage door opened at about 7:40 in the evening. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter Sienna in the truck. And as soon as they were gone, the killer darted forward, tipped over the heavy plastic garbage can at the end of the driveway, and then retreated back into the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a very long time. It annoyed them that everyone in town seemed to think that Don was so great that he was some kind of saint. Because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been a drug-abusing loser with 2 older kids that he didn't even seem to care for, and another one, Sienna, who he deserved to lose. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So, the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it. But finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud, constantly hovering over their life, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to have his schedule figured out. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's house that evening. They knew he'd be coming home alone after that. And they knew that before he went to bed, he would almost always go out into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand. It's a small, heavy wooden bat that truckers use to check their tire pressure. And as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 o'clock, Don's truck came down the street. He pulled into the garage. And just as the killer had planned, while Don was out at the curb fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind the neighbor's SUV as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed the button to close the garage door, and then went inside his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into a better position to ambush Don. And as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door's safety sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those little lights flashing. Thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to force the garage door to close. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement from inside the townhouse that would suggest Don had heard the noise and was coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. The killer breathed out a quiet sigh of relief and took their position near the interior door, waiting in the dark. After a while, the doorknob jiggled. The killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon. And as soon as Don opened the door and stepped into the garage, they struck him in the head so hard that the wooden tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage and resentment they had been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. He was a strong man, and he was fighting for his life. He had turned his whole life around. He had a daughter that he loved more than anything, a daughter he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here in his garage. And so, as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer, scratching and clawing. But he had been gravely injured in the initial attack. And when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck to hide. But the killer was relentless. They pulled him out and landed one last brutal punch to his face. Don stopped moving. And at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat, and they squeezed and squeezed until he went limp. But the killer still wasn't done. To make absolutely sure that Don was dead, they went back into Don's apartment, they grabbed a large knife from a butcher block in the kitchen, and they came back into the garage. They knelt down next to Don's body and ruthlessly slit his throat. Blood ran out of the wound and began to pool on the concrete floor. The killer then found some bleach under the sink inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could. But in their haste, they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life that night. But by aggressively fighting back against his attacker, he had given investigators the one clue that would eventually solve his murder. And he would also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would be able to grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind, the evidence that solved the entire case, was a tiny speck of DNA found under Don's fingernails. And that DNA belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's house until 9 o'clock that night was a lie. His sister had covered for him. And so on the 3rd of April 2017, just over 3 months after Don's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After his arrest, Terry tried to cast blame on his wife, Christine, Don's ex-wife. He claimed that she was the one who had put him up to it, that she had manipulated him into killing Don so that they could have Sienna all to themselves and stop dealing with the custody arrangement. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder. But the charges against her were eventually dropped due to a complete lack of evidence. There was nothing to tie her to the crime except the word of her killer husband. Terry White, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.